Well, let's construct a model here before we answer that, okay? People live the majority of their life in familiar feelings. You wake up in the morning as Ben, you look over at your wife and you remember your wife. That begins to fire certain circuits in your brain. You have certain feelings for her based on past experiences. And you lay in bed and you think about all the things you have to do and all the problems you have. And every one of those thoughts begins to produce a certain emotion, and you start to reaffirm your identity. You get up, you look at the dresser your grandmother gave you, you unconsciously perceive it as something. Then you go to the bathroom, you use the toilet, you think of a cup of coffee, you get a cup of coffee, then you go back into the bathroom, you take a shower, you dress, and then you go back and check your emails. You have this certain routine that you do. And because those familiar emotions ground us in our identity, then the moment we are feeling the same way every single day, then all of a sudden we begin to live life from particular biology, okay? And so then you start thinking about all the knowns you have to do in your life, all the people you have to see, the places you have to go, the things you have to do at very specific times. And you anticipate the feeling of every single one of those events. You start to think about how they're going to feel. Oh, I got to see that person. Oh, I got to do that thing. I got to go shopping. I got to do this. And the reason that you are having a thought that's producing an emotion means you can predict that future and you're going to know how it's going to feel. So if you can predict the future event and you know how it's going to feel, then it means nothing new can happen in your life, because a new experience should have a new emotion. So people unconsciously begin to select knowns in their life, and they begin to emotionally embrace it, and what they're doing is they're limiting their possibilities. So it limits the amount of room for the unknown or the uncommon to happen in their life, because their body's programmed into a predictable future based on the emotions and memories of the past. So then, certain things in our life bring pleasure. If you start thinking about a cup of coffee, or seeing your new puppy, or coming home and seeing your wife, or whatever it is, you select that thought in your mind. And if there's a reward that goes along with it, something that's going to feel good, the amazing effect is that your brain begins to produce the exact chemicals in anticipation of that event. So your body is beginning to anticipate or expect that future, and your body's preparing itself for that event. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, because you're anticipating the reward. But the antithesis begins to become a problem. When you're thinking about going to work and sitting next to the coworker you judge and hate, when you're thinking about waking up in the morning and you got to look for your pain in your back, and there it is because you look for it. You have a deadline for something that's taking all of your time and energy. People have certain problems in their life that have emotional correlations. So then as they begin to look at those issues and things in their life based on the knowns, they begin to create the very emotions that keep them enslaved to the past experiences, and reality stays exactly the same. So if feelings and emotions are the end product of past experiences, and you can remember experiences better because you can remember how they feel, and those emotions are familiar, it tells us two things. Number one, nothing new is happening in your life. And number two, if you can't think greater than how you feel, or feelings have become the means of thinking, then you are literally thinking in the past. And your life is going to reflect that. So then getting people to begin to change that from the old self to the new self really requires a tremendous amount of awareness. According to the psychological and scientific model, the majority of people in their waking day, in a normal day, spend about 70% of their time living in stress. And living in stress is living in survival. And the actual definition of stress is when your body's knocked out of homeostasis. Stress is when your body's knocked out of balance. The stress response is what your body innately does to return itself back to order. You have three types of stress. You have physical stress, like trauma, injuries, accidents, falls. You have chemical stress like bacteria, viruses, blood sugar levels, heavy metals in foods, hangovers, whatever. And you have emotional stress like traffic jams, internet connections, second mortgages, single parenting, 401ks, family tragedies. All of those things knock the brain and body out of balance. Now, all organisms in nature can adapt to short-term stress. A pack of coyotes chases a deer in the forest. The deer outruns the coyotes, the stress is over, the deer returns back to homeostasis and it grazes again. The event is over. When the deer perceives a threat in its external environment, it turns on a primitive nervous system called the fight or flight nervous system. And that autonomic nervous system, that sympathetic nervous system, begins to mobilize enormous amounts of energy for some threat in the external environment. Now, deer has all its physiology changed, all the blood is sent to the extremities, heart rate increases, respiratory rate increases, pupils dilate. The 1,300 chemicals that are created in a matter of seconds is to cause the deer to survive in some difficult condition. Now, human beings have the same mechanisms, and when we perceive a threat in our external environment, like a lion, we are going to run or fight or freeze. But if you've had problems with your coworker, or you've had a very difficult experience with your mother-in-law, the moment you perceive your mother-in-law or your coworker, you have a past experience with them, you're going to turn on the same primitive nervous system just like you're being chased by a lion. So what was once highly adaptive now becomes very maladaptive, because when you're mobilizing all of that energy, you are going to operate in very predictable ways. You're going to be an amped up animal with a big memory bank. So that your blood flow is going to go to the hindbrain and away from the forebrain, which means you're going to react instead of think, rationalize. But human beings, the privilege of being a human being is that we can make thought more real than anything else. That's the privilege. So then you can begin to forecast some future worst case scenario. And you can attend to that thought to the exclusion of everything else. And you can focus on it to such a degree that you will begin to anticipate the event and produce the same chemicals as if you were in that experience. And you're knocking your brain and body out of balance just by thought alone. You can begin to unfold some past bitter memory that's tattooed in the recesses of your gray matter. And like magic, you can bring it to life. And in that moment, it's real. And you will produce the same chemistry in your brain and body as if that event occurred. And your body, as the unconscious mind, is literally living that experience. So then, when we're living by the hormones of stress, and you turn on that stress response, and you can't turn it off, now you're headed for some disease. Because no organism in nature can tolerate living in emergency mode for extended periods of time. So if 70% of the time a person's living in survival, living in stress, in survival, what we do in order to survive is we are going to select the worst case scenario. And we are going to begin to plan our behaviors and our emotions in that experience, because anything less than the worst case scenario means we have better chances of survival. So we plan for the worst, we emotionally embrace it, and anything less means we can survive. So out of the infinite potentials in the quantum field, anxiety really represents a poor imagination, but it's highly adaptive if you're living in survival, because you got to get ready for that. So 70% of the time, people are selecting the worst case event in their life and emotionally embracing it, and they're programming their autonomic nervous system into a very specific destiny. And it turns out if you keep doing that and you create the emotions of fear and worry and anxiety, and you do that for 10 years or 5 years or 3 years, your body is going to unconsciously become programmed to fear. And it's going to have a panic attack without you. Try as you may with your conscious mind to control it, you've programmed it subconsciously. And now the body as the mind is running the show. So the hormones of stress create the emotions of anger, of aggression, of hostility, of violence, of frustration, of hatred, of fear, of anxiety, of guilt, of shame, of hopelessness, of powerlessness, depression. Those are all chemicals that are derived from the hormones of stress. And when we live by the hormones of stress, we become very selfish. Why? Because when you're in survival, you got to take care of the self. Your attention is on your body, right? Your attention is on your external environment. There's predators out there. The rush of adrenaline causes the senses to become heightened, and you're a materialist, and you're trying to predict the future because there's better chances of survival if you can predict the future based on the past. When that occurs then, over time, the body begins to break down, because it's a scientific fact that the hormones of stress downregulate genes to create disease in the long term. So if you can turn on the stress response just by thought alone, and the hormones of stress can make you sick, then your thoughts can literally make you sick. So the question is, if your thoughts can make you sick, is it possible then that your thoughts can make you well?